This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with RA Judy, who teaches in the Department of English at University of Pittsburgh. He is the author of a number of important articles on aesthetics, language, and knowledge production in the broad Black intellectual tradition, as well as two books, Disforming the American Canon, The Vernacular of African Arabic American Slave Narrative from 1992, and Sentient Flesh, Thinking in Disorder, Poiēsis, in Black from 2020. In this conversation, we explore the place of diverse languages in Black studies research, Black study as geographically adventurous, and the importance of thinking and practicing community work inside critical theoretical study. Good afternoon, RA. How are you today?
I'm fine.
So it's great to have you on the podcast. I'm so happy that you made time. I've really loved your work for years and years. And so having your voice on the podcast is really important for me personally. I also think your contribution to the field of Black studies is enormous. And your book on the canon has come up in a number of these podcasts. And so I know there'll be a lot of people saying, I mentioned that book in my episode. Let's go hear what the author has to say. So welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. I'm really grateful for your time and thankful in advance for your thoughtfulness in the conversation.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I've been following your podcast, and I think it's really a substantial contribution. So I was quite pleased and honored to get the invitation to contribute to this collective conversation. Right? This is an important archive that's unfolding in real time, as it were.
I appreciate those words. I mean, Ashley and I, started this podcast with a very modest aim. Maybe we have 24 friends between us who we could convince to record, but it's turned into really a fabulous collection of conversations and archive, as you said, living archive of the field of Black studies. I think your episode will be episode 228, 229. So we've really built quite a few of those, and this is going to be a real highlight of the conversation. So thank you. And we'll have a chance, of course, to talk about your research, about how you imagine the field of Black studies and the relationship between those. But I wanted to start really with a more personal question and ask you, what drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life? And what sustained you in relation to this kind of work?
Well, I mean, the short and accurate answer to that is being born. My formation is not disciplinary.
Mm-hmm.
I was born in South Minneapolis from two solid middle-class families, both of which were active politically. My great-grandmother on my father's side, Marie Boswell, was one of the founders of the W.B. Du Bois Reading Circle in the Twin Cities, and which is a gathering of illustrious Black women, including the founder of the Spokesman and Archie Gibbons' wife. But in any event, it was at listening to those wonderful events, these elaborate teas where they would discuss Du Bois's work, that I was introduced to Du Bois and introduced to a certain aspect of critical thought that constituted what we called then Negro culture, or colored culture, as my grandparents were wont to say. And my mother's father, who was born in New Orleans of a Cuban father, was a Pullman porter and a Garveyite, and a friend of, I don't know if you know the important leftist thinker Nelson Perry,
Mm-hmm.
who did a very important book on the Black radical, the education of an American revolutionary, was from Minnesota, and was a good friend of my granddad, Floyd Manson, as well as my great uncle, Kenneth Judy, who was also a Pullman porter. So I was raised in a milieu where attention to intellectual traditions was bread and butter. It was what we did. and also in a moment in South Minneapolis, I was born in 1954, which was segregated based upon covenant practices. It was a different Minneapolis than the one that's being presented in the media now. Had a number of institutions of Black civil society that promoted this kind of consciousness.
Okay.
And, these were at moments prior to the establishment of Black studies as a field. And then also importantly for me, Margaret Jefferson has a great book on Jefferson on Negro land, about that moment in the 60s and 70s where there was the transformation from Negro to Black, and the class aspects of it and the gender aspects of it. And I was in the midst of that. And so in the late 60s, I became very much invested after 1968 in Black power. And in 1970, in fact, was brought in through the efforts of a childhood friend, James Lawson Jr., in what turned out to be a failed effort to start a branch of the Black Panther Party in the Twin Cities. He died in the course of that effort, but after his death, I continued the kind of work that he had asked me to do, which was setting up a liberty school and disseminating the party paper, and in that school teaching the wretched of the earth.
Wow.
As well as, of course, Mao's Little Red Book, things the party did. And that's when I became very much invested in the work of Fanon in that context. So I'm already coming out of a radical Black family tradition. Mixed radical, because the Boswells were part of the NAACP, so you've got the racial uplift people, but the Garveyites with my grandfather, and then that primed me for the moment in which Black power and Black consciousness was articulating itself. All of this is outside of the academy.
Yeah.
Right. This is the momentum that's going to lead to San Francisco State College at the time opening up the first program.
Mm-hmm.
And department of Black studies, in contrast to what Yale will do subsequently. So that's my formation. That's my introduction to these questions. So it's less a question of what brought me to Black study than rather what brought me to the Black study of living.
Mm-hmm.
If that distinction makes sense.
Yeah.
There was a tradition of sets of practices and of thinking, and they were very formalized. Things like the Sabathani Cultural Center, or the African American Cultural Arts Center, or the Nakarima Club, which my grandfather was part of the formation of, or St. Peter's Church. These institutions that had us dwelling on matters of life, for everything from Plato's Republic to Langston Hughes's poems.
Mm-hmm.
And the orientation was not at all in a sort of reaction or response to the white culture, but rather to insist upon the generation of life and joy and our attitudes towards things and our ethics and our morals. That's how I was formed.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's that formation that led to my subsequent, more focused academic intellectual endeavors,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to the other way around.
Yeah.
So I've never really been a part of the formation of Black studies as a discipline, but rather the Black study of life. And that took me in a number of ways. It's what informed my decision to become a Muslim. That had complicated family aspects to it, and I don't mean Nation of Islam, but Sunni Muslim, and
Mm-hmm.
to go to Al-Azhar University in Cairo in pursuit of a degree, initially in Islamic law, but eventually in Islamic philosophy and Arabic literature, and I ended up getting a degree in Islamic philosophy, all of which was part of an elaboration, in my view, of the Black study of life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in fact, that project stemmed from a kind of crazy idea I had as a young man in 1972, that the future arena for trying to struggle for what we understood then was third world international solidarity was going to be international law. and that I thought there was going to be two metaphysical camps coming out of Fanon, the Islamic and the Western.
Mm-hmm.
And so my pursuit of Islamic law was an effort to try and be firmly grounded in both camps.
Interesting. Yeah.
And as a foolish young, 17-year-old imagining that, or 16-year-old, that I could address a contradiction in Fanon or do something Fanon aspired to but didn't achieve, which was to bring those camps together.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so the project at Al-Azhar was one of really deliberate and systemic Arabization, I call it, ta'arif.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what was evident in my first book, Disforming the American Canon.
Mm-hmm.
I came to Complit kind of in a peculiar way because my undergraduate degree was in Islamic philosophy, and I had wanted to continue philosophical study, and I wanted to focus on phenomenology and hermeneutics. And I spent a year in France, and then ended up coming back in 1981, 82. And and this is after, of course, having spent 5 years in Egypt in the 70s. And when I came back and I applied to programs, there weren't many programs interested in supporting degrees in phenomenology and hermeneutics at the time, because that was the moment in which philosophy was turning hard towards what it is now, analytical philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And my undergraduate advisor, Bernard Terrell, had recommended that I apply to Comp Lit, where this guy, Vlad Godzic, was the only one on campus who was doing Heidegger and Gadamer and hermeneutics and the sort of things I wanted to do. And so that's how I applied to Comp Lit at a time in which, Godzic was instrumental in developing the theory movement. And the program that he was running, and then the department, was very much focused on those philosophical texts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so my comparative literature formation really was a function of that.
Mm-hmm.
And still then, my focus was the Black study of life in these matters. And so in Disforming the American Canon, what I was trying to do was challenge the Eurocentric nature of comparative studies. And again, following Fanon, aspire to the articulation of conceptual grounds. At the time I talked about it as a different metaphysics from those that were at the basis of European modernity.
Mm-hmm.
And my focus for that became this text that I came upon in Atlanta by Ben Ali, which is still the longest Arabic text left by those who were enslaved. It's not gotten as much attention as Umar ibn Said's fragments. But coming upon that text, because it was so pronouncedly an Islamic text, it was rather well known. Chandra Harris has it appear in one of his novels. The linguist Greenberg did some studies of it, and they all made certain statements about what it was, which was an autobiography, and it was not. But in fact, it was an excerpt from a very specific Malachite legal treatise. And the way it was structured and written was an expression of that view of the world, and that it was expressed in that way in the United States. You can see why this becomes a focus of what I wanted to elaborate, right? As a comparative study, here we're now going to compare different conceptualizations. In fact, part of the story I forgot. From my undergraduate work, what I wanted to do was I went to a program called University Without Walls. As I said, my formation is not very disciplinary. And I wanted to do a B.Phil, which I did in Islamic philosophy, but I wanted to do a comparative study of Descartes' skepticism and Imam al-Ghazali's skepticism. And this was in 1980. And the philosophy department at the University of Minnesota wouldn't accept such a project. They thought it was absolute fantasy.
That sounds like such a great project.
Well, now.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. No, I know.
But,
Just laughing about how intrigued I am by this project. But of course, I mean, the discipline of philosophy.
40 years ago, it was, who's Ghazali? And so I ended up doing a B.Phil that focused on logic, working with Anwar Shehni and Bernard Terrell. Shehni being the Ghazali scholar, because that was the problem. The philosophers didn't know anything about Islamic philosophy except what Rescher had given them as problematics of logic. So I wasn't able to do that kind of comparative study. So the Ben Ali text in Complet enabled me to take up that call of comparison
Hmm.
on slightly different grounds. I say slightly different grounds because the emphasis of my training in Complet was in semiotics. And so literature is understood as a system of representation like any others, a particular kind of mimetic system.
Hmm.
So it was still what some would consider philosophical. That's why I say slightly different grounds,
Hmm.
but still in pursuit of the Black study. That is to say, the engagement with a certain set of practices of living and questions about life that are informed by the historical tradition in which I was formed
Hmm.
across a number of different discourses, a number of different media.
Hmm.
And in so doing, elaborating a conceptual framework on its own terms,
Hmm.
which I don't know if you know the book, but I lay that
Yeah,
out
yeah.
in the introduction, and part of my critique of what happens with the history of the discipline and the difference that I try to mark between San Francisco State College and Yale's project,
Hmm.
right? Where the former was an effort to, in Fanonian terms, reorganize and reconceive the humanities
Yeah.
in a way that was, as Césaire would put it, adequate to the world. Whereas the latter, Yale project, was to discipline it in accordance with the established structures
Hmm. Hmm.
of the humanities, what Sylvia Winters called in Black Metamorphosis the sort of Bantuization, little Bantustans,
Hmm. Hmm.
and marginality. So in that book, I lay out this is what I'm trying to intervene
Yeah.
in that distinction, and really reviving and insisting on uh, um, the force and the adequacy of the San Francisco State College initiative,
Hmm.
which was trying to achieve an epistemic rupture, trying to do something different.
Hmm.
So that's how I came to Black studies. I say by being born.
I love that. I love that. I
Mm.
mean, first of all, your articulation of the description of the milieu into which you were born, right? As having this competing tension between the sort of NAACP Garveyite sort of parts of family, which political and cultural sensibilities, and then the way that is interestingly kind of translated in this moment of your own research as a doctoral student or undergraduate, right? Sort of negotiating these, Yale, San Francisco State, and thinking about, how to think those tensions and pushing I mean, I love that book on the American Canon because for exactly the reasons you described there. I mean, it comes up regularly in these podcasts with some regularity in these podcasts because I think it makes I appreciate it. I appreciate everything you said. It was super interesting and important. And I especially appreciate this last little bit of press for those of us who are not only interested in Black studies as a sort of curiosity or a workplace, but its transformative power or its potential transformative power. That we're living in this moment of, will Black studies as a field even exist? Will it be able to survive as an institutional form? In its institutional form, a whole Trump presidency and whatever comes after. But in that moment of thinking about survival, I appreciate these reminders that, there was also this aspiration of Black studies to completely transform what we mean by education, right? To completely transform even what we mean by the university. I think like Corey Walker's podcast talked a lot about this, about the idea of the Black Studies University being one wing of the push in the moment of Black studies, like an actual different idea of the university. And the way what you had to say here already draws like really deep roots into not just what it means to form a department or a program of Black studies at a university, but the way that's drawing on these long-standing social, cultural, and political organizations in African American life for 2 centuries.
Yeah. No, exactly. I mean, when I was growing up, as I said, I was born in 1954. When I was growing up in the 60s and the 70s, I graduated high school in 73. In fact, I was a bit of a troublemaker. but I won't go into that. I don't mean a troublemaker in terms of being a knucklehead or a criminal, but a radical, and forced the school system to put in place Black Studies. What at that time we called it Black History Week, right?
Mhm.
But outside of the school system, in the space that I grew up in South Minneapolis or in North Minneapolis, we had Sabatini Center and the Afro American Cultural Arts Center in South Minneapolis, and we had the Way in North Minneapolis. These were centers of learning in which we were educating our children ourselves,
Mhm. Yeah.
right? And so that we would be transmitting the tradition of our thinking and our living practices.
Mhm.
So it was very much about what I'm calling the Black study of life.
Yeah, yeah.
That if we want to give it that kind of a label where we assume casually that if we're reading Aristotle or we're reading Spinoza or we're reading Derrida or we're reading Lyotard, we're reading meditations on the general questions of life. But those meditations are informed by very specific conceptual foundations.
Yes.
And so the tradition I was formed in was working with a different set of conceptual foundations. Not absolutely different because it's Western. It's a set of foundations that are created in the interstices of capitalist modernity.
Mhm. Mhm.
But the inflections, the innovations, the particularities, whether it was Martin Delany, whether it was Frederick Douglass, whether it was A.J. Rogers, whether it was Bennett before the Mayflower, and these were all, texts and authors that were given to me at a very young age. All of those were giving a conceptual expression to a long set of practices of living. We would call them experience at the time.
Mhm.
The aim of which was to bolster in our children. I was one of the children, our sense of ourselves, in spite of
Mhm.
the general societal structure. I mean, this became instrumental in the violence that erupted in my high school because I went to a rather elite public high school, and I was only among the second group of blacks coming in, and that was the tension that we had knowledge, we had a sense of ourselves that really contradicted the normal structures we were being taught. Africa had no civilization, slavery was good for these things were still being taught.
Yeah.
But because of the formation we got in our neighborhood, in those institutions such as the ones I just listed, we knew better.
Yeah.
And because of that formation, because of the moment of Black power in the late 60s and 70s, we wouldn't shut up about what we knew.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
And so, and what we insisted on, for example, the school was Washburn, and there was a series of general strikes and direct action we used to make a point. We were insisting that that knowledge be included within the curriculum.
Mhm.
So it really was, as Sylvia Winters put it, the streets coming into the academy,
Yeah.
which is again what happened in San Francisco State. And I'm trying to emphasize something that because the orientation was not to become domesticated or disciplined,
Yeah.
right? But to compel a change in social structure by changing the epistemology of the institution, by bringing our voice in
Mhm.
as a
Mhm.
transformative voice. Um, I don't think that momentum has disappeared from the population at large.
Mhm.
And I think there's a lot of maybe later on I can talk about some specific projects I've been involved in that incline me to think it hasn't disappeared. I do think though that with the professionalization and the disciplining of Black studies, that there's a sort of rupture that occurs, almost like a turning away from that project. I mean, one way I put it sometimes is as, we were sent off into the university as a kind of foragers
Mhm.
or reconnaissance foragers. We were out,
Yeah, interesting.
and with the expectation we were going to bring back what we had foraged.
Mhm.
This is different from Plato's allegory of the cave, where we kind of escape on our own
Yeah.
and we acquire the knowledge of the subject of knowledge, and we're going to go back and we're going to enlighten our backwards brother. No, we were sent out to bring back stuff for use for the community, and at some point institutionally through professionalization we turned our back on that and didn't come back.
Mm-hmm.
And our emphasis as practitioners, now intellectuals, was on professionalism and on the academy. Uh, what Bundy said in the Yale event that Robert Steptoe and Skip Cates put together back in the 70s. There was going to have to be that decision between activism and scholarly excellence, which is a false distinction, but it's the one that was held.
Yeah.
And the latter, scholarly excellence, took over.
Mm-hmm.
So a whole different set of metrics took place that were part of the discipline of the academy that were really at odds with the dynamic of the formation of the Black study of life.
Mm-hmm. And that sort of maybe is already a response to the second question that I had for you, which was how you do imagine the field of Black studies, because as you have articulated in multiple ways, there is this tension at the beginning of the founding of the field, right in the late 1960s, between that commitment to activism, that commitment to a certain kind of political prescription, and the pursuit of the Black intellectual tradition, the development of it, the appreciation of it, that students in that moment had demanded both a place to study Black life, right? That becomes this sort of intellectual wing of the field, but also that happening in the late 1960s, early 1970s, is a time when the radicalization of Black liberation struggle had really obliterated those boundaries between campus and community, between study and politics. And that's, I think, where also there's that Black study demand for a certain kind of political intervention. And I'm curious how you think, because as you said, I think that tension is still with us, those sort of competing demands of the field. What is that portrait of Black studies that you work with in relation to this tension at the origin of the field?
What do you mean by obliteration?
Obliteration may be a little too strong, but it really complicated that distinction between study and activism. I think that idea that Black studies was going to be simply a classroom endeavor at the founding of the field, that I think the radicalization of liberation struggle had really questioned those boundaries, that a campus and a community are not two separate spaces, but they need to have a coordination of thought and action, right? That is not just sort of like students leaving the campus, but as part of the study of Black life.
Of course, Moten and Harno have a wonderful conceptualization of this, the undercommons, which speaks to the broad history of the university and its relationship to society. And I want to be clear about how I think that takes up the question you're asking. If we look at a place like San Francisco State College, or even we look at a place like Hanover, Yale, you've got a situation in which here's an institution that has a particular social function of disciplining knowledge and disciplining knowledge in the service of state power. And that goes back to the University of Bologna and the ways in which the sort of revival of Justinian's law plus the translation of Arabic texts leads to the formation of canon law, and then both the papal state and the feudal state become concerned with managing the kind of studying that was being conducted by groups of students. And so that's the discipline we're talking about, and that goes to the fundamental history of the institution. And so you've got an institution that has that function. And of course, we can talk about, and I do this in this formula, we can take this back to the German Research University and to the history of the university in the United States in the 19th century. That's its function. In Black communities, right, in urban communities in which they begin to encroach on the physical space. And they're there as a kind of interruption into the dynamics of the life of the community. And there is a particular American inflection to the town and gown tension in that regard. So what happens with Black study coming into the university is a pushback. It's a battle, right? Okay, you're in our space, but now we're going to invade you and we're going to try and make the university responsive to our collective needs.
Yeah.
And in that sense, also responsive to a broader international collective need of transformation. So we're going to change the university. and we're going to try to make the university an instrument of social transformation in a particularly radical way. We lost that battle. Okay. So what occurs at Yale is the university maintains its integrity, as Sylvia Winters has a very nice analysis of this in Black Metamorphosis, in which that momentum that you're calling activism is disciplined.
Yeah.
Right. And a kind of slippage takes place. We lose our way. We slip a bit, where we imagine that our success vis-a-vis discipline is still equated with social transformation and activism.
Mm-hmm.
So our ability to get promotions, our ability to establish publishing lines, our ability to try to secure line items in decanal budgets to establish departments and programs, we construe now as having something to do with social transformation. It doesn't. It's completely within the confines of the institution, and in a very marginal way. So that defeat of the project to transform the university means that those of us who go into that professional line, and this is why I say we turn our back on those who sent us to forage, as it were. Those of us who go into those professional lines become dedicated to that success, and we're no longer speaking to the people outside the gates of the university. I'm speaking in broad terms. We could get specific, or almost broad terms, because we know the situation in New Haven and the tension between Yale and the Black community, and the ways in which all the dynamic things happening within Black studies there have little impact upon the Black community. Or we could even look at Columbia with its great new program, and yet its relationship to what's, that part of Harlem that Columbia is still in there's a disconnect. Or at my own institution, the University of Pittsburgh, we have an outreach center, but it's an outreach center where the university is going to offer certain access into the professional structure of discipline, but not at all be an engagement with the intellectual dynamics of the community.
Yeah.
That's where we are right now. And this is how I think we got there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so when you say, it's there's a real disconnect, right, of activism and intellectual work that is introduced by the academic disciplining, right? Hare at San Francisco State didn't imagine the distinction between activism and intellectual that we're discussing now. Right? That it was a part of the conceptualization of what we're doing in life practices, and a part of what we imagined was the revolutionary project of achieving a universal social justice. Thinking was part of it. We were, what in some discourses would be called organic intellectuals. But I want even I'm shy of that word intellectual, because when we become intellectuals, that's part of the disciplining structure. So that rupture you're talking about is introduced by becoming part of the academy, and is at odds with the practice of thinking that had been part of the very formations that I'm trying to recall in my own telling. I don't know. I hope that was.
Oh, that was fantastic. No, super insightful.
But doesn't speak to the question of the future. It doesn't speak to the question of the future.
Well, we have plenty. We still have time to get to that. I did want to shift a little bit and ask you about your own work. You've talked a bit about it. You're interested in aesthetic theory, of course, engagement with questions of language, and of course, in comparative literary sensibilities. And there's so much insight for the field of Black studies in that collection of approaches and interests. And so I'm interested in how you think about your work and how it fits into the history of the field of Black studies, but also what boundaries you think it pushes, or what new horizons you hope that it opens up.
That's a very interesting, challenging question. I'm probably going to get in trouble for this, but let me try to be coherent.
Go ahead and get in trouble.
I think I've tried to make clear that I've always been a kind of internationalist. really from the cradle, but in a very cogent way since I was 16 years old. And that was one of the things that took me to Cairo, Egypt in 1975, a particular moment. And in that experience of those 4.5 years, nearly 5 years really, in Cairo, where I was encountering the world, and it was the Islamic world, but the world, Africa, Asia, parts of Europe, uh, something confronted me profoundly, a number of things. But specifically, nobody wants to be a Negro. And I can give numerous concrete examples of what I mean by that, but nobody wants to be a Negro.
Mhm.
And, that has something to do with what Cornell's been talking about recently as the niggerization of America. And I became interested in trying to figure out what it was that nobody wants to be. What is it about being Negro
Mhm.
that is almost universally problematic? In fact, I'm part of a UNESCO scientific committee that's looking at the global Black anti-racism. And what became very apparent to me, and this was through careful study of different discourses, different populations, was the Negro was a people without any kind of mythology, any kind of foundation, right? That population created and completely destroyed in modernity without any hope. Nobody wants to be that at a moment in which neoliberalism is emerging, and that's the threat for everyone.
Mhm.
Right? That became the focus of my work, elaborating what that means. Right? And what I mean by that is that this population that was so constituted, and here I took a sort of cue from Edward Glissant, in tension with Stuckey, was a population that constituted itself in the very moment of violence. Right? That was generative, that was poetic, and had a profound impact on the world. So even though they had no mythology in the sense of an ethnic national identity, they were generative and poetic, and in the very history of their articulation exhibited a universal human capacity for creativity,
Mhm.
right? And a very anthropocentric, that is to say, humanist, not based in some transcendent truth, revelation,
Mhm.
or the subject of knowledge, but coming out of the actual practices of living,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
That became the interest of my work, articulating that dynamic.
Mhm.
And I already explained how I began to explore this in this Forming the American Canon, but in Sentient Flesh in particular, this is what I'm trying to elaborate with the concept of autopoiesis and what I now call poetic socialities. In other words, through careful study of expressions that people engage in that I think manifest this capacity to create ourselves, right? And
Mhm.
you can see that parasemiosis is related to what Winters calls autopoiesis, that we see a record, an archive of a human capacity,
Mhm.
right? So the significance of the so-called Negro to life, and of course, that capacity of autopoiesis is what I would mark as Black study.
Mhm.
So in that work, I want to elaborate through concrete examples, beginning with Du Bois, through the Wyndham Thomas text, because I'm very much interested in 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 what people are doing, and minding what they're doing, and minding what we're doing in relationship to them.
Mm.
What C.L.R. James in the Johnston Forster movement called the working class self-activity.
Mhm.
Right? So my examples there, from Du Bois, Thomas, to Wyndham Thomas's remarks, or Thomas Wyndham's remark, forgive me, is specifically to take up common practices, to the engagement with the buzzard loop dance and juba, the things that people do and the way in which that manifests is an articulation of this autopoiesis and parasemiosis of a way of being in confluence with a number of things, or
Uh-huh.
to use the blues metaphor, at the crossroads.
Mhm.
My current work is wanting to elaborate that further, and I call it poetic socialities.
Mhm.
And in the immediate context, I'm interested in the way in which various populations who were captured into slavery in capitalist modernity and dispersed throughout the world from the Indian Ocean, Iran, the Arab Gulf, to the United States, produce practices of song, of dance that speak to a kind of cosmology of confluence that resemble one another,
Mhm.
right? And I begun to try to look at those things specifically in those resemblances, things like in Tunisia, Stambali, or in Morocco, everyone knows the Ghanawa, but there's the Zar in Egypt, and there's the Sar in Oman, and all of these different individual practices where there's profound resonance and wanting to understand or even map, as it were, those resonances as an elaboration of the historical practices of parasemiosis as characteristic of Black study of life.
Mhm.
And to think about Blackness in that way. And here it talks a bit, I'm on the future if I can. Bear with me a minute of the field, because this is a project that's meant to try and talk about our moment. The project I just described, this Poetic Socialities, has a complex genealogy that I just told a little bit about. But it has, in the short term, it stems from certain collaborations. And these are international collaborations.
Mhm.
And starting in 2011, during the early phases of the Tunisian Revolution, I had been a Fulbrighter in Tunis in 97, 98, and I had been a student in Tunis in 85. So I had a relationship to Tunis, and I knew a number of the people who were involved in the revolution. And in fact, we produced a volume in Boundary 2 called the Tunisia Dossier, in which, in the midst of the revolution, activists who were involved were recording what they were doing and why they were doing it. And that was my pitch then. Let's record this and archive it before the Western press gets hold of it, before the experts get hold of it, and analyze what you're doing away from it, right? And I'm very proud of that in that sense. So it's in those early stages that I began to work with Tunisian scholars and activists who were part of the struggle. And that collaboration continued well through to 2016 in a project we called, in a very Fanonian way, الثورات العربية والإنسانية الجديدة, the Arab revolutions and the new humanism, which was housed at the University of Tunis, Al-Manar, with funding from the Rosa Luxemburg Center.
Hmm.
And it generated a series of workshops involving various grassroots activist groups across the country.
Mhm.
So this is why while the voting is taking place, there's a real transformation, and we're out there dealing with the different groups, the women's cooperative, different unions. And it culminated in 2016 at a conference held by the city of Kasserine, which was the epicenter of the revolution. And my contribution in this collaboration was twofold. They brought me in as one of what they considered one of the leading Fanonists. Some people say I have that hat. I don't know about that. But also in taking up the question of Black study, which was something that the Tunisians were very interested in,
Interesting.
right? And they were looking at the 70s and the 60s, and they were looking at the radicalism of that and that effort to try and achieve an epistemic rupture, right? And wanting to know more about that, right? And trying to formulate their own relationship to Black studies. So, what I contributed to the Kasserine event was something that I called, rather provocatively, and it really kicked up a storm in a generative way, الدراسات السوداء العالمية, the global Black studies. And there's a linguistic trouble there because of the way in which Sauda, Black, is used to talk about Black studies. What does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And an occasion to elaborate what I mean by the Black study of life. And is this an ethnic category, or is this an orientation in thinking? And if it's an orientation in thinking, what does it have to do with us? Right? And of course, the answers to there have to do precisely with the common history of modernity.
Yeah.
Right. That we're all populations who've had our traditional structures disrupted, and it brought into modernity in a very particular way. Not erased, but disrupted, and we're re-articulating them in certain kind of revolutionary ways.
Mm-hmm.
Which this is something that they find very interesting. In fact, there's a project I'm involved in now in Senegal called GAIAC, which is trying to formulate a kind of set of workshops to bring people from around the diaspora in Africa as a part of the effort to reimagine Pan-Africanism along these lines.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, this is a quite different take to Black studies, and for me, I think that's the future, right? Because it's a take that is in keeping with the initial effort to try and formulate a way of thinking in spite of modernity, and formulate it in a way that can perhaps reimagine the university.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the GAIAC project is trying to imagine an alternative university, precisely at the point where the university can't do this kind of work, but it's the work that's being called for by the various popular uprisings that are going on right now. So that becomes the work of a kind of global Black studies, which you note is not national oriented. It's not U.S. oriented, but it calls for a kind of formation of a global solidarity and global conversation. And that's the work I think we need to start to do.
I love that. Thank you. That's an amazing and response to the question, but also a really important challenge, intellectual and political challenge, for anyone listening, working in the field, about how to think about their own work and their own efforts, their own research in relation to exactly these imperatives you're talking about. Because as you've already said, I mean, this is not sort of R.A. Judy's, out of nowhere sort of idea. This is part of the foundations of the field. It's part of the founding of the field, and that thing that's faded in some ways through institutionalization, but things fade. They can always be rehabilitated and developed and extended. So I appreciate that as a completely interesting articulation of your own research and its future and how it impacts the field of Black studies, but the way that also sits some really deep moral and political imperatives for everybody listening, like puts it right on our desks. I really appreciate that. And I just wanted to maybe follow up then a bit on your research, on your orientation as a researcher, and ask you, you've talked about, about how complicated even that question of, what is your education? What is the education in Black study? That's going back to, as you said, the fact of being born. But also I'm thinking specifically in terms of your graduate work in comparative literature, which is, I mean, comparative literature both is and is not a discipline, right? It's literary, but it's comparative literature, so it is always going to engage in these other kinds of theoretical formations and habits and theories. And your current appointment is in the Department of English, which is a disciplinary department. So you have this sort of interesting relationship in terms of your education and your workplace in relation to disciplines, but your work is also so deeply embedded, as you've articulated in multiple kinds of ways, in the field of Black studies. So I'm interested in how that movement you've had both inside and outside of disciplines as a graduate student, in terms of a department in which you've worked, but also the non-disciplinary work that has the deepest roots for you, but also ongoing practices inside those disciplines. How that movement between discipline and non-discipline has shaped how you conceive a research project, and maybe even how it's impacted how you conceive a classroom.
Oh, that last bit is a very, very interesting and serious question. I bear with me, please. Uh, as I said earlier, my formation is non-disciplinary,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm less engaged in the field Black studies, although I recognize that my work will circulate there, than I am in my orientation in the Black study of life, along the lines I just described as
Mm-hmm.
parasemiosis, right? Yeah, so that's where my focus is, and I'm a forager. I was sent to forage,
I
right?
love that. If nothing else, that's
And
such a great term for people to take away from this podcast.
and for me, uh, uh, nothing is dispensable,
Hmm,
right? I
yeah.
don't accept. I think it was Lord who talked about you can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. One, I don't care about dismantling the master's house. What I care about is the houses we're building.
Mm-hmm.
Two, anybody's tools are useful, right? بحث العلم واجب. The search for knowledge is mandatory, even if it means going to China. So my approach to Comp Lit was as a potential space to do the work I wanted to do,
Mm-hmm.
right? And at a moment in which, because Comp Lit was not even a department, it was just a program at the University of Minnesota, I had the freedom to do that, right? Because it itself was not disciplinary, but itself was a program of confluence.
Yeah.
Which was a great deal of the political tension with departments of French and Spanish, precisely because it wasn't disciplinary. And because of that, it was seen as being potentially hegemonic. But for me, it fit the model of what I was saying was the reason people didn't like Negroes. Too much confluence, too much parasemiosis, right? So the education I was getting in Comp Lit at Minnesota was precisely what I was looking for, both in terms of orientation, and I'm trying to avoid the word discipline, but methodologically.
Mm-hmm.
So the emphasis on, as the Panthers used to say, before you talk, you got to do the research.
Mm-hmm.
So the program's demanding that we have languages and have deep languages, and we attend to philology and we attend to cultural history, was in keeping with that dictate. Okay. And the discipline in a different sense, in the Gramsci sense, when he's writing to his nephew about the need to sit down and read at a young age, so you discipline the mind and the body to sustain reflection, right?
Yeah.
And that's the methodology of comparative literature at the time, because of course it's still under the sort of shadow of Auerbach, but is breaking away from what I call the Four Horsemen, or the last man standing school.
Mm-hmm.
The concern about whether or not that kind of formation is possible anymore. And their concern, Auerbach and Spitzer and others, was predicated upon the premise of the nation as a certain kind of horizon and the dissolution of it. For me, Comp Lit was useful because, coming again from the orientation of Black study, there was no premise of the nation that was being dissolved, but it was always the issue of thinking in disorder. It was always the issue of creating in flight without having to postulate a transcendent or mythological grounding. So Comp Lit for me was an occasion to forage. And precisely because it wasn't disciplinary, it allowed me to forage in those ways. As I said, I wanted to do philosophy. Philosophy wouldn't let me do this work. Comparative literature would at that moment. Right?
Yep.
Whether it can do that now is another issue. I mean, I was part of the Charlie Brenner report, in which there was a call for Comp Lit to become less Eurocentric and bring in other languages. And we're no closer to that now than we were in 1992 and 94.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Right?
that's for sure.
Comp Lit has become disciplined. Now, of course, going into English, when I came out and I finished my degree in 1990, Comp Lit programs were already under the gun because of changes that had taken place with the Cold War and government funding and literature programs, et cetera, and cultural studies was emerging as that which was going to take its place. And significant English departments had been the most resistant to Comp Lit when I was in graduate school. But in the 90s, they embraced the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies.
Mm-hmm.
So my first placement, I taught at Macalester, then I taught at Swarthmore, and then I got my first full-time job at Carnegie Mellon in the Cultural Studies program.
Interesting.
Which was one of the few degree-granting cultural studies programs in the country, right? Now, again, that was because it would allow me to do certain things.
Mm-hmm.
So in that program, I could teach modern Arabic literature. I could teach Arabic social realism. I could teach a course, one of my first courses on aesthetic theory, where I began with Ice-T and then went all the way back to Shaftesbury to say we can't understand what Ice-T is saying about his aesthetics if we don't look at the history of aesthetics to understand whether or not he's breaking from it.
Huh. Nice.
And from Shaftesbury, walk our way up through Kant and then to get back to Ice-T. That's what I could do in that context at cultural studies, which of course caused people consternation because the cultural studies people of the Birmingham School didn't know what the hell I was doing because it wasn't sociological in their way. And
Yeah.
the classical literary people said, "What the hell are you doing?" You know?
Yeah, yeah.
But again, it allowed the occasion. Now, when cultural studies got in trouble at CMU because of a change in funding, DOD money was becoming less than it had been. And the Moravian, the president who came in, very expressly wanted to go what was called the SIRT model, every barrel on its bottom. So any department that could raise $1 million or more in soft money had the freedom to pursue its intellectual agenda. Any department or program who couldn't was going to be a service program.
Yeah.
There was no way cultural studies was going to raise that kind of money.
Jeez. Yeah.
So I moved over to Pitt through a Ford Foundation fellowship I got, where I moved over to Pitt in English. Again, in close collaboration with Boundary 2, where, again, I was looking to forage.
Mhm.
And my situation in English at Pitt has always been marginal in that regard. So, I would do things like teach the course in modernism, where all of the novels were African and Arabic.
Mhm.
And my colleagues would say, "How is this modernism?" And I would have to explain to them how it's modernism. But you can see how it was breaking the disciplinary model because
Yeah,
they're
yeah.
thinking of modernism in terms of very specific genre attached to very specific languages and very specific nation state formations.
Mhm.
And of course, they were completely ignorant of the history of colonialism and thought of African literature and Arabic literature as little Bantustans that had nothing to do conceptually with the general history of the novel.
Mhm.
So I've always done things that way. Regularly teaching undergraduate courses in words and images, which I teach as a course in semiotics. And again, or even teaching composition. The one time they made me teach it, which they will never do again, in which my examples of because I wanted to teach the academic essay, which they were opposed to. But my examples were James Baldwin and Orwell side by side, approaching this as a matter of style and narrative form.
Mm.
Again, the Black study of life, right? That there's certain resonances here, that this is not simply identity politics, but we have to actually read the discourses at hand and understand their role in our current social reality. So, playing the blues, as it were, performatively as opposed to thematically. So my relationship remains non-disciplinary all the way through.
Love it.
I mean, right now, finally, we have an Arabic studies program at the University of Pittsburgh. It's brand new,
Mhm.
and so I'm able now to teach straightforward courses in modern Arabic literature and in Islamic thought. So the disciplines are sort of catching up with me, as it were.
That's that's great. Thank you for that response. That was amazing, and again, as this really great testimony to the power of disruptive pedagogy and syllabus writing inside of disciplines, which disciplines find ways of catching up to, but there's something immensely pleasurable about hearing the way you were going to take on a modernism class. I have to say, it's a real decolonial kind of work, but it's decolonial in a place where, as you say, the history of colonialism isn't even on the table yet, but you've already taken that step.
Yeah, and pedagogically, I should add as well, the disciplines chasing behind one, but hopefully never catching one. But
Absolutely.
but yeah, exactly. Pedagogically, I mean, there's a class I like to teach called World Literature. It's called World Literature in English, and I generally have taught it by teaching works in translation. But the past couple of years, I insist on teaching works written in English. But it becomes a class in which we delve deeply into the history of the novel, and we delve deeply into the Aristotelian concept of mimesis as a way of understanding novels, which means that we delve deeply into the history of the formation of capitalist modernity through the novel.
Hmm.
very limited pedagogical goals. I want the students to know what mimesis means. I want them to understand it as a practice and how it can be useful for formalistic analysis of a text. So we can talk about what novels are doing and not talk about novels through the prism of ready-made identities, right? And then at the same time, the question becomes then, okay, if the novel in its style is trying to represent a world, what's the world and how is that expressed in the style? And then we read a number of novels written in English from around the world that challenge the notion of the novel as either a bourgeois form or as a national form. And thus far, I mean, I've done this twice now, the students are really quite responsive.
Love that.
It changes how they approach reading in a fundamental way.
Yeah.
And which is my goal. I just want to give them, whether they're going to become doctors or engineers, I want to give them an understanding of the ways in which systems by which we represent ourselves to the world are powerful, and that we are actively engaged in.
Yeah. This is a fecund insight, to put it lightly. So, well, let me ask.
It's a lot of hard work. It's a lot for students, especially those of Generation Z. It's a lot of material they're not used to, and it's a lot of stuff they have to get together. It's a lot of hard work.
I like that part as a father of a Gen Z college student. I'm like, more of that for him, please. Do that as well.
How does he respond?
Terribly, but I hope he doesn't listen to this. Terribly, but
no, I've seen some of. Forgive me if I may. I've seen some of your Facebook blogs, and he seems to respond well. He seems to be open to the challenges.
I may be less generous than his professors as his father, but I think that's part of the job description.
Less generous with yourself than him, I think.
Probably. Well, let me ask. I have two final questions for you. Very short questions, speculative questions. The first one is, thinking about the history of Black studies and its future. What do you think that the field has done well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Again, you keep asking these field questions and disciplinary questions, which I'm not very, very aligned with. So it's the word field that always stops me there. The disciplinary field, what it's done well is turn away from. And in so doing, it has failed its reconnaissance and foraging mission.
Interesting.
Which is one of the reasons why we feel a crisis now.
Yeah.
Right. Part of the turning away from was institutional, when those of us engaged in this project became dependent upon the institution's resources. Right. And so, we're given skim budgets.
Yep.
Few lines. Constantly put on the back foot, or we're always in a defensive posture, which cultivates a deep-seated sense of being under siege, which interferes with intellectual development. That's structural. That's institutional. Yeah. If you always have to defend your program on the budget, if you always have to defend your department on the budget, if you always have to argue for every line, right? Then that defensive posture becomes ingrained, and you're feeling marginal to the institution. And so you're always feeling as if you are a petitioner.
Yeah.
That gets in the way of thinking and work. And that generates all kinds of competitions we deal with, and all kinds of puerile infighting and jockeying for positions for the sake of getting what few crumbs can be distributed. Right? So what we've succeeded at is what we failed at.
Yeah.
As a field, right? We've succeeded at the field of Black studies and failed at the field of the Black study of life.
Well put, concisely, but also deeply troubling, in productive, hopefully productive ways. So I appreciate the precision of that formulation, and maybe related to then my final question for you, which is, thinking in the context of Black studies, what is the issue you would want us to all be thinking about, or what is the question you would want us all to be asking?
Well, I don't know if there's one question.
I don't think anybody's ever had one question. So, podcast tradition to have multiple.
I think there's, for me, the the motto, the imperative that I think we all need to do, Black studies and beyond, is mind what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean that in a very specific idiomatic way. There's a story I like to tell. To convey what I mean by mind what we're doing as a motto and imperative. So my mother's father, the one who was who had a Cuban father, used to have to cut his grass every Saturday. Granddad, I like to cut his grass, and back in those days, when you were trimming the edge of the lawn, you had hand trimmers.
Mm-hmm.
And you had to get on your knees and cut. You're probably too young to remember this, but you had to do it. And
actually, I'm not too young. I'm probably too young technically because there were other apparatuses, but I did not grow up in a home that had the class status to get the one that lets you stand up. So I have done this as a.
So you were down there.
I've made a preteen and teenager living doing this. I know exactly.
So you know exactly.
My knees started to hurt. I feel
and your hands cramp. Your hands cramp up, and so. Anyways, and Granddad was really, really very, very peculiar about how he wanted things done. And he had the class issue. He had an electric mower, which was a big deal. And my job was to make a straight line. Okay. And one Saturday I'm doing it along, and I make divots. And Granddad came out to me and said, "Mind what you're doing, boy." That's what I mean by the motto. We need to mind what we're doing. To pay attention to what we're doing in the middle of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? To ask ourselves, what are we doing? A cui bono? To what aim are we doing it? With whom are we doing it? And in that vein as well, then we need to, as I said earlier, mind what the people are doing. We are in conversation with the people.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we need to do. We need to mind what we're doing. From that, all kinds of questions and possibilities emerge. But if we can do that simple thing, and you know what I mean, minding what you're doing, making that line straight while you're doing it is a real charge. But I like those old stories from the old folks who would in those few words give us a whole year's worth of lessons.
I love that.
Mind what you're doing, boy.
This is a fantastic place to wrap up and take something to take from this podcast as a concluding note. And, thank you for your time. I was looking forward to this conversation. It's just been so rich and complex and challenging and just really getting deep into the foundations of what all of us do in the study of Black life and Black studies, outside Black studies as ways of study. This podcast has really touched on everything I think that's essential to thinking about the questions of the podcast. I appreciate your thoughtfulness so much, along with your time, RA. So, again, appreciate you being on the podcast, and this is just a wonderful contribution to the series.
May I add something?
Absolutely, please.
One of the things about this podcast is you are minding what we're doing.
Thank you. I take that as a real compliment. We are trying, I'll tell you that.
No, this is a sign of what we need to be doing.
All right. Well, I will take that. That brightened my day. I got to go teach in a little bit here. Not bright part of my day, kind of dreading it, but I will take that. That's a very kind thing of you to say. So,
thank you for having me.
Well, have a great rest of your day and be
you
well.
too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Enjoy your class.
Thanks. Bye-bye.